Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of the New Stack, and you're listening to the New Stack Analyst podcast, a show about application, development, and management at scale. Thanks for joining us.
We're at ServerlessConf Austin for a day of podcasting, talking about serverless technologies, those who are using these emerging technologies, and the practitioners and vendors who are helping users to onboard and adopt serverless methodologies. Hi, I'm Benjamin Ball with the New Stack. We're here today at ServerlessConf Austin. We're talking about serverless security, basically. I'm joined by three different wonderful people. First is Mark Boyd, writer and analyst at Platformable. Two is Guy Podjarny, CEO at Snyk. And our third guest is Paul Johnston, founder at Roundabout Labs. Great to have you guys here.
Thanks for having us.
Very much. It's good to be here.
So let's, just to get it clear for all the listeners, everyone take a second to talk about who you are and what you do. Keep it on the brief side, guys. So Mark, let's start with you.
Okay, right. I regularly write for the New Stack around serverless technologies and what's happening in the industry. I guess one of the things I'm hearing, I always ask the question about security when I'm interviewing people, and quite often I'll get service providers who won't want to go there, like it's someone else's concern. So there's sort of a little bit of a disconnect that I see, and we talk about dev teams incorporating serverless into their work rather than it being a separate concern. And I think there's still some way to go before that's reality sort of thing. So I'm keen to hear what you both see around that sort of perspective. And also from like with IoT being such a perfect use case for serverless, I'm again interested in hearing about how security is going to be dealt with in IoT serverless architectures.
Cool. I'm a Guy Podjarny, Guypo. I'm sort of long-time AppSec person, wrote the first firewall web security scanner, did some time in the performance space, and now I'm the CEO of a company called Snyk that helps you use open source code and stay secure, including the open source components that are used inside serverless applications. So I'm one of those people that tries to answer the question around, DevSecOps or whatever it is that you want to call it, and how do we embed? I've been trying to get developers into security for about 15 years now. So.
DevSecOps, it's a brilliant name.
Or whatever, OpSecDov, whatever.
Hi, I'm Paul Johnston. I run my own consultancy called Roundabout Labs, but I also am a CTO with a startup in the UK, but I'm talking not as the CTO, I'm talking about as me in this context, and I've been using serverless contexts and ideas for the last 18 months, so it gets quite interesting.
So we've kind of chosen the topic of serverless security here. I think you all might have different perspectives at approaching this. Guy, my understanding is you have a session about serverless security, and I actually spoke to your developer evangelist in the past already about the serverless story with Snyk. So maybe start us off with actually just talking about how you see serverless security right now, what you think the big concern is, or the big focus is for you when it comes to making sure that serverless technologies are secure.
So I think serverless, there are clearly several aspects of it. I'm going to talk about this for about 40 minutes or so tomorrow, but
let's we'll try and piece it apart a little bit.
But fundamentally, I think maybe the key thing about serverless security is that it moves the concerns from the infrastructure level to the higher levels, things like the application security, to data security, configurations, network. It just emphasizes that more. And it takes certain security, big security concerns like patching your servers, or concerns around denial of service, or a long-term compromised services, so an attacker can come in and nestle down, just sort of lay in waiting inside a server and penetrate further. Many of these concerns are just implicitly removed, which is awesome. But other concerns get elevated. Attackers don't just, give up because you've gone serverless. Unfortunately, that's not the reality. So it raises concerns around application security. It raises concerns around the amount of data we move around, the data we move into third-party services, so there's more trust, more secrets. And then specifically, I'm also, this might be a gap, but I deal a lot with application dependencies, with like these NPM packages or Maven packages that you sort of pull in. And today, they fall into this twilight zone in serverless, and these functions, there are these sprinkles of infrastructure that you put inside your application and deploy, and they remain unmanaged. They're neither managed by the serverless frameworks themselves, nor are the application owners really well aware of them or tracking them. And over time, these are known components. They're downloaded by the millions, if not more. And over time, they have security vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities, and they grow stale, they grow vulnerable, and nobody knows. So they become the easy way in. They're the application version of an unpatched server. So this is an area, this is where my product is. This is kind of where Snyk deals with, and we help you deal with that. But I believe it is one of the least sophisticated, and yet most grave concerns for serverless, because it's the easiest way in for an attacker. So I guess kind of coming back, it's mostly about this move from infrastructure to highlighting these different concerns that are more at a layer up on the stack.
Interesting, and I was going to ask maybe if you have your own perspective on this, Paul, and maybe add a little bit of a intro here. I know you've written about serverless for a long time.
Yep.
Yep. I have maybe even a more specific question for you, which is basically no matter what ecosystem it is that we survey, everyone's always going to say security is a thing that they care about.
Yep.
Is there necessarily things different about serverless architectures that make security important, or is it something where it's always important and it should be more about maybe not necessarily security in general, but the architecture that you use?
Yeah, I think I can take that one on. It's essentially when you take on a serverless architecture, you do cut out some of the problems that you would normally get. So you don't get the same problems around denial of service. That's a third-party provider's problem. You don't get the same problems necessarily around, for example, if you use DynamoDB, then you kind of cut out some of the problems you'll get with SQL injection. So you'll have different kinds of you remove a certain set of problems and you bring in a certain set of other problems while you're doing all of this. So when you're talking about whether it's an issue and everything else around, who should basically deal with security, how should you think about it within the context? I think I would say the same thing I say about developers and DevOps, which is I basically say that actually developers need to consider operations. They need to think about infrastructure when they're developing, whereas actually a lot of developers now will build something and actually say it's your problem, you run the infrastructure. And I think that's the same with security, that actually developers need to be more aware of security now using a serverless infrastructure or an idea, because it's so new, no one's really thinking about these things at the moment. So you've got to kind of take the responsibility on your shoulders. It kind of makes developers more, slightly more scared about taking this kind of thing on, but actually the benefits of understanding what's going on and will mean that you end up with something better at the end of the day. So I think if you jump in and get on with it, it has real benefits.
If I can kind of highlight that, like the notion, and like to me, serverless is the epitome of DevOps in many aspects. It moves continuous deployment and many of these like super microservices, that we're doing up to the next level. And in the process, it kills all hope of being able to manage these through an external team of, an understaffed external team of InfoSec people that are monitoring your application. It was never a good idea even before, cloud computing. It was not a good idea when it was a worse idea when DevOps came about, and serverless just continues moving us down that path where the responsibility moves on to the developer. Some problems move to the platform, but the remaining problems have to be a part of the dev process. So,
I feel like Mark, you probably have a few things to say here.
I'm interested in, I think there's a few things around some of the infrastructure tooling, I think. So we heard today from Srini from Capital One was talking about how they've got their process around using DynamoDB as part of their serverless transaction hub. But then because DynamoDB doesn't have encryption of the data, then they've created their own tooling for that, which they'll then swap out once that feature becomes available. So I guess that the security layer within that platform architecture at the moment is like at the identity layer. But then once you're in the identity layer, then the data still needs to be encrypted. So there's sort of those sorts of things that still need to be fixed along the way.
Yeah, and I think, when you look at things like encryption and encryption at rest specifically, but also, data on the move, there are issues that come into that with security, and we haven't got the tooling for that yet. We have to roll our own a lot of the time with serverless at the moment. But I would say that if you look at the other side, where you're not using serverless and the normal way of thinking about it, I actually think that most people don't take those concerns into consideration anyway.
Yeah.
So I think if you're even having that conversation in your company and you're using serverless, I think you're probably several steps on from the majority anyway. So you're probably going to make a better solution at the end of the day. So yeah.
And I agree. I mean, I think fundamentally services that are available and the granularity in which you can apply them on the cloud platforms like on AWS are better in serverless. You can contain access controls for a given function around which data it can access and on which network it can access at a far better granularity than you probably would reasonably have done in a non-serverless environment.
Well, that's why.
So there are gaps.
Yeah.
There are still tooling gaps, but I think you're already good. The challenge is that it's not easy.
Yeah.
I think security. We're all lazy. We like doing, and if security is not easy, it doesn't get done. But I think it's a good thing that it raises the profile about questions like the gaps, and it will become easier over time. So
I think that granularity. I mean, like you can see with IBM OpenWhisk announcing they've got they're bringing that API gateway into their functionality in order to give that sort of identity management granular permission level to functions, so I think that's a really great step forward. I like the idea. There was also a talk today about modern agility, and I've forgotten the name of the speaker.
Mike Roberts.
Mike Roberts, yeah. And so then that reminded me of this, it reminds me of this whole move towards there's sort of like a paradigm shift that's happening with microservices and all this sort of stuff, but you see it in serverless as well. And security, it's got to be not about being this IT blocker that's saying no as a form of prevention, but more about how do you do detection and correction so you can build resilient systems. And then, so Mike Roberts was talking about not having the fear of failure, but then how do you allow this, how do you try to build those resilient systems when security can, but you can't do that if you're using serverless for a transaction hub for a bank, sort of thing. So where's the line as far as where do you experiment with serverless and be willing to make mistakes with security, and where is it a line issue?
Well, I think that comes down to the whatever the company is doing and the willingness of the CTO. But there are certain things of certain back-end processes or workflows or things that don't have necessarily the data concerns and the security concerns, where you can play with the technology, so you're not necessarily bringing it into something mission critical. So I don't think that's necessarily difficult to bring in, but I would also say that one of the advantages of using something serverless and the serverless idea is that everything's uncoupled. The data, if you want to be able to change, for example, if you've got a single DynamoDB table with data that needs to be encrypted in it, you can just run a function to encrypt it, and everything that puts data in needs to encrypt it in a certain way, and everything that pulls it out, you're not changing large bits of a whole, you're changing maybe 2 or 3 different things, which is a heck of a lot easier than the ways that you would do it if you had, say, a relational database that's being talked to by 10 different applications. So you do have an advantage with a serverless approach that you can limit access to data in quite clear ways, and then security becomes an easier concern to think about.
Yeah, and I think you have access to it. I'd say serverless as a concept is not inherently less secure. I think it's inherently a little bit more secure in kind of your granular access and in pushing some security concerns to the bottom. But I think serverless is a new technology. So I think the risks around not putting a bank system through it right now have very little to do with the fact that this is serverless versus microservices versus something else, and more to the fact that it's only been around for whatever it is, 2-3 years, if that. So I think it's more the maturity of the platform that keeps it away, and maybe some of the tooling around the ecosystem. It offers the opportunity. Maybe this is also another reason we're talking about this. At least part of the reason that I am excited about this is kind of one of my concluding components, sort of slides in the talk is. I think we have an opportunity to embed security in serverless because we are shaping new best practices around how we build software. What's the right thing to do about it? Around scale, around visibility, around monitoring, around kind of proper management over time, and around security. Then you can build it in, and we're doing it sometimes because you have to do it. You mentioned API gateway or like the access policies. The thing is, you're forced to create them. You cannot deploy without being like you cannot deploy a Lambda function without being asked who can access this function and what can this function do. You have to define a policy to it. It's still a little too easy to make it convenience still trumps there. It's still a little too easy to create like one wildcard, asterisk policy and just assign it to everybody. But at least you had to answer the question, which before you could just implicitly ignore and make it whatever it is that's sort of the default in your sort of in the ether kind of led you to. So there are good controls there. It's not mature yet.
And I mean, as a quick and simple example, we have every single policy within our AWS stack is denied by default the ability to delete anything from the database. That's just every single policy has that as a default. That basically means we don't lose data because there is no way of deleting data. That's at the infrastructure level rather than someone accidentally writing a bit of code that deletes the whole database or someone hacking in. But so what I know is that our data is not going to get lost. It may not be the best data, it may be really badly structured, it may be a whole load of other things, but I know the data isn't going to get lost.
And then like iRobot just gave an example about how they manage their IAM, their sort of user access controls separately in source control and reapply it regularly. So that prevents the slip, like it prevents the somebody came in and gave some elevated access to it, then you can notice that, but also over time you don't just say, okay, that's just a small slip, and then there's another small slip there, another small, policies have a tendency to expand and they never contract. They never kind of go back. So methodologies like this around, rules that say you are not allowed to do this, policies that get reapplied again and again, just so this visibility gives you the tools to do it. Although I will come back to, it's hard to wrap your head around all these different components, like managing 1,000 policies is hard. But then, so you need simplicity there.
But this is where that building in the resilience in the system, because it's easier in serverless. So there is some stuff I've heard around logging, which is again a fairly immature tooling, but it's getting there. But then as far as in the real world, you might have an access control level where only someone has the ability to change some data or something, but then you've got to give that control to someone else as well to be able to do one-off function or something, one-off bit of data cleaning or whatever. And then when that normally happens, though, it's that wild card, so suddenly everyone's got it. But in the logging, in being able to do big logging at scale and using serverless technologies, then you're able to actually set up thresholds where it'll stop you. When it notices something like that, it can actually put the brake on it, make sure that you get the clearance from someone else, and then reinsert you back into the system. So it sort of is acknowledging the need for that flexibility without being like a hard stop that just creates, that doesn't actually open any doors for anyone, but actually allows the system to sort of run, but still have safety and security.
Itself. I think serverless allows you to put these questions and hooks everywhere. You could just scatter them around, and you can ask about everything that happens and all that. You need to unveil some blind spots. So with X-Ray, AWS have just unveiled some blind spots around how long it took to download a Lambda function from S3. Like application dependencies, another example of a blind spot. You don't know which dependencies you have in your system and whether they're vulnerable. So there are blind spots today, and you need to elevate that information. And then the system is kind of designed to be able to, once information got elevated, act on it. Again, as long as you can kind of manage that complexity, but at least the information is there. While before you wouldn't know what's going on, and you definitely wouldn't be able to interject. So so from access policies to data encryption to to redeploying to user permissions, you have the hooks now.
Yeah, and I think if you read the best practices of the cloud providers, they tell you we should have been doing this all along anyway, and they say that we should have been doing this with instances, and we should have been stopping all.
Right.
We are lazy because we didn't need to, essentially, because we could control. We had a bit of control within the server environment, and we did all the controls in there. So it's kind of something that's always been there, but it's never really been touched. And I think most of the services that you see outside of a serverless idea are like that. You're the developer or the creator is still in control. They think of the structures and the security within their container or server. And I think what going serverless does is it strips that away and actually makes you have to think about that at the infrastructure level rather than the code level, and that makes it a very different problem.
Right.
I will say that the thing that scares me the most about serverless security in the long run, today there are gaps. There are things that we need to fix and we need to establish best practices. But the thing that scares me long term the most is bloat. It's just managing 5,000 of something, of anything is hard. And in serverless,
completely agree.
Serverless removes, all but eliminates the reason not to deploy a function. You've got a piece of code, there's no cost to it, it's not hard to deploy it, you just deploy it. You hear all these talks in other podcasts about somebody deploying, moving all their cron jobs to be serverless functions. And that's cool, and it's awesome. But then those things stay there. Removing them, knowing whether somebody uses them, what permissions do they need, they never get removed, and they just get it. And there's this notion that because there is no operational server cost, there is no cost of ownership, and that's not true. So that's the thing that I don't see in all of these narratives. All these blind spots get removed, all of the tooling gets around. I don't know fundamentally how do we get over the fact that we are going to be over deploying. We will have to, and that's a massive attack surface, which scares me.
And this plays into sort of what I was going to ask, which is we talk a lot about security. We've been talking in the new Stack about security with container ecosystem for a long time now. It's something where it feels like a lot of the lessons we've learned with cloud and containers, almost like we have to relearn them again for every new technology, every new environment that we're moving into. And maybe that's just security as a whole, as a section that people focus on. But my question is sort of more along what Guy was getting at. It seems like we sort of understand maybe some of the security issues now, but is there areas where we're going to open up new problems as serverless is a growing space, where more users are actually taking on this functionality, and actually more teams are adopting serverless technologies? Is there something to be worried about down the road that we can sort of cement now with best practices? You mentioned bloat. I wonder if there's anything else that's sort of on the horizon. And maybe this is vague, but I kind of want to...
I'm waiting for Guy to talk while I have a think.
Well, so, I kind of mentioned one, which is bloat. I think it's fundamental. I think in general, the notion of packaged software is one that is both one of the core tenets of that makes us move fast. In containers, in open source code packages that we use as a whole, they help us kind of build on the shoulders of giants, right? Or crowdsource, really. This is like Wikipedia's impact on software development, right? Just so we tap the community. But at the same time, it means we replicate flaws. This is taking a bit of a divergence to give Paul time to think. I just read this interesting article around AI ethics, which is a totally different topic, right? Autonomous systems, how the ethics system happens, how do they adhere to norms? And there's this problem there, which is you now need to encode norms because you will now have 1 million of something that is acting by that norm and behaves that way. Packaged software, as you sort of, you have goodness in it and you have badness to it, but you now magnify it to a lot of those components. So I think packaged software is another area of it. It's sort of the bloat. It all comes back to just like the size of numbers. Anything good that we do is better, is amplified, but anything bad that we do here is just manifest as well.
And I think the really interesting space that you can think about with this is actually the third-party services that you use. You are going to be trusting. There is an implicit trust in the third-party services that you use, and there will be a lot of people within the serverless community who will start to use metrics platforms, analytics platforms. They'll be using all of these different things, different data solutions which are third-party provided that provide something specific. So we're going to have GeoIP-based data services. We're going to have data services around user data and so that will do your user data for children maybe, or there'll be various different services that provide all of this, all of the solutions around serverless. And I think that's possibly more of a problem in terms of security, and in terms of what happens if they get hacked, what happens if they get bought, what happens if they get if they decide to turn the service off. You've got all of these problems around that. Who owns what data? And then you've got data protection problems, and then you've got all of So I think that it brings in other concerns when you're not doing it all in-house in your own servers and on your own premises. But they're conversations that we've had for years around cloud. So I think there are other wider concerns with serverless.
Yeah, but serverless manifests them. Yeah, I think third party. It was worthwhile giving you time to think. It was a really good package. I see it as a continued path of the same thing of packaged software, because like packaged software, you're consuming somebody else's software, you're trusting it implicitly. When you're running it on somebody else's service, then the level of trust is even greater, and you're just continuing. And this is, talk about lack of solution. I mean, there's one company I'm aware of called Security Scorecard, which is for banks and stuff, does it. And even for them, it's a challenge. I think there's like a couple of companies starting there, but really it's a nascent space. So I haven't seen any solution that really like moves the ball forward around how do you manage third-party trust as it explodes. I mean,
and as an example, if you're using a third-party system for doing some data or analytics, how can they guarantee to me that they are storing my data well and that they are not going to, what are the certification that I need to see? What's the
third parties they use,
and the third parties they use, and what cloud are they on, and how far down the rabbit hole do you have to go to make sure that you are compliant yourself with whatever regulation you have to worry about, and also can guarantee, or at least get a semblance of a guarantee of security.
Well, you're based in the UK, so you won't have to worry about GDPR, the European...
We will still have to worry about it, but we just won't be able to change it.
I don't think we signed away privacy with the Article 50.
Right.
I think there's still some sort of desire to keep that a little bit.
Right. Well, you don't have it here in the States now with internet service providers.
We've got our own problems.
Yeah, sell whatever data they like.
Is there, I want to circle back to something actually that Mark brought up relatively early on. You mentioned Mike Roberts' talk about modern Agile, but I talked to him beforehand. I didn't get to see the session, but he told me it was largely about sort of a serverless as a way to do continuous experimentation. Basically that you can swap out things very quickly and try new things and new approaches, and that some of the challenges that brings is frankly what we've talked about for a long time in containers, is you can spin up something very quickly in seconds with containers, milliseconds perhaps with serverless. Is this something where the change itself is where you're making yourself vulnerable, just the fact that you're constantly breaking and changing things? And I sort of ask this because I think it fits in well with Guy, as sort of you're catching things as they're going into code, just having that extra layer of making sure you're not screwing something up as you're changing things around.
Yeah, I think to me it aligns with this notion of kind of shutting the door on the gate-driven security process that exists today, right? So security today, the normal operates at this gates. You stop here and I will audit, right? You stop here and I will review. And that just doesn't work when you're working in a mode in which stopping is the enemy, right? You don't want to stop. You're continuous. You want to always go. I think continuous processes from container to serverless to other environments are a threat and an opportunity. It means you cannot stop, and that's sometimes scary to existing processes, but it means that once you secure, you're securing predictably. You're building automation into your process, and that's kind of the holy grail we eventually want, right? We want security. We want the same place in which we run a unit test to run our security test. So it's painful today, but I think it's a little bit of medicine, it forces us down a path in which security is intertwined with the application, because it's just impossible to do it any other way.
Yeah, and to add to all of that, when you're looking at security and things going wrong and things coming down, and when you have uncoupled lots and lots of functions, you may only bring one down, but if you've got a container and it goes down, you're bringing the whole thing down. So there are different problems, and so with security, if you bring a security hole into your application, you may actually only bring it into quite a small space within a serverless environment, whereas within containers and instances, and then you can actually add more access than you want to your system. So I think there are, it comes back to there are some inherent security good things within a serverless approach.
If I can throw in a small plug, is I actually have a different podcast I do more or less frequently called The Secure Developer, and we talk about these types of topics all the time.
Cool. So look that up in your podcast directory. Search it out. So then with that experimentation that Mike Roberts was talking about, so then it's coupled with that idea of you don't start with the most vulnerable areas of your business when you're building out serverless experiments and that sort of stuff. Start with something safe. But then it's almost like, do you need to build like a serverless chatbot in Slack that will say, hey, have you thought about security with this from the
Making
developers?
security visible is hard. Like security is to an extent like insurance. You only hear about it when it goes wrong, right? You only hear about it in disasters. The thing that gives me most hope is that ops used to sort of fall under that same bucket. All these statements you said about not being the one that says no, and only hearing about it when there's a disaster, and ops managed to break out of that. Now today, a good operations team, a good DevOps team, good DevOps process is widely perceived as a business enabler. It's something that helps you go faster, something you can build on. So the hope, or kind of the aspiration, is to be able to get security to be a place like that. Right. But the path to that destination is not entirely clear. No, I battle with that daily.
Especially when you get left off email.
If you're,
I got to CC the security guy.
if you're like monitoring an application for vulnerabilities and you don't get an alert for a vulnerability, how that's a good thing, but then how do you even remember that you're doing it and are aware that you're not doing it in another spot? It's just like these conversations about security being invisible is tough.
But you take it again. I kind of hark back to what we did in the past, if you like. Having a server, you had to sit on the right mailing lists and you had to be in the right chat rooms to know that things were happening at any one time. And if you weren't in them, you just didn't know they were going to happen. You didn't know that you could be hacked. And I think that's where, making much smaller pieces hackable and then making it more hidden, in a sense, means that you actually get an improved system. But yeah, you are right that it's security. Unless you've got it as a built-in thought process when you're building something, retrofitting it is really hard.
So something that we talked about today, there's a session tomorrow by Florian Motlik. He's going to talk about tooling in the serverless ecosystem. So maybe kind of my final question, and Mark might have another one for you guys. I'm wondering, is this something where you're expecting to see more security tools in this space as serverless matures? Obviously, Guy, you've launched a security-focused product recently. Is this something where it's going to be built into everyone else's products, or is this something where there is space for more tooling specific to serverless security? I'm curious because as we look at a developing ecosystem, what kind of tools people are creating and where they see gaps is sort of important to us.
I think, as a broader serverless tooling conversation, I think we are missing an awful lot of tooling, but I think the reason we are missing the tooling is that we haven't got the patterns yet. I think we're still quite a long way from really fully understanding the patterns that are going to come out as best practices. I think a lot of people are saying they've got them, but I actually don't think very many have. I think we're probably a year away from even knowing roughly what they are. So the tools that come out that fit those patterns will be the ones that end up being the ones that we use. But I think tools like Guys and they are there, and we should be using those kinds of things anyway. But it's the tooling part of it is going to grow massively over the next few years, and we're very, very nascent at the moment.
Yeah, I guess I would say there's also there are kind of two classes to it. There's supporting serverless, and then there's serverless specific products. So like in the case of our example, for instance, we launched a specific Snyk for serverless that helps you tackle this problem of vulnerable dependencies in serverless in an easier way that is attuned to how serverless works. But the problem in the tool, like as a whole, Snyk as a whole, is not dedicated to serverless. And I think that will happen more and reasonably fast. Just sort of existing monitoring companies, existing tracking, like all sorts of cloud watching capabilities, things like that. I think they will evolve to support serverless, and many have. But they're not attuned to serverless yet, so they'll sort of tweak that. And then there's, I think, room in a security perspective, there's probably room for a small number of categories that are specific to serverless security to talk about how do you instrument serverless, which is different, just with the event-driven and all that, for security issues. When you think about securing the unit versus securing the whole, so like what is the whole that you're trying to attack, so that you can identify a bad pattern from a good pattern, somebody coming in and manipulating the flow of functions that happen versus the individual function. So there are questions around that which I think are super nascent. The good news is that I think serverless attracted large business. I think Austin mentioned this in his talk in the morning as well, far faster than many technologies do. Very, very big companies because of the cost savings aspect of it, I would say the most, but that in turn drove a very quick startup land, being from Israel and being aware of the Israel tech scene. There's a whole slew of serverless related security startups going on right now. So I think as compared to other technologies, I actually expect this space to evolve reasonably fast.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most advanced work is around identity management and access control at the moment within serverless. As far as the tooling, I think the logging is coming up as an area. And then there's there's still a lot more work, and you're seeing where that needs to be done and how that's progressing. Yeah, I like the stuff around the best practices not coming out yet, because it feels like there's a change this year at ServerlessConf so I think everyone knew serverless was about event-driven processing, but we were talking in terms of functions and that sort of thing, and then it feels like this year everyone's like, wait, no, the paradigm is event processing. Like, that's the core of it. Like, it's no longer data, is the core of our systems. It's the events that are the core of the system. And it feels like everyone's like, hang on, we've got that, It feels like a bit of a mind shift. Yeah.
I'm quite glad about that, because, you kind of have to keep banging the drum for people to sometimes take notice of it. And, a lot of people have been focusing on the functions and kind of being a very small part of it. But as soon as you go round to the events, you widen the net of understanding and scope of what gets fitted into the serverless.
I don't want to cut us off here, but we really need to wrap this up. So, Guy, it looked like you had a comment, so maybe we'll...
I was just going to agree to say that by the fact that we think about this as event, you can adhere to models around event-based systems in the past and then replicate those, while functions are this new thing. And so we didn't have a reference. Security or otherwise, it's useful to think about it in the right model.
Great, and I think we've covered a lot of ground here. Probably we could keep going for another hour if I let you guys. So thanks for joining us, Mark, Paul, Guy. It's been great. I think a really good discussion, and probably a lot more we can explore in the future. So thanks for joining us, guys.
Great, thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Analysts at thenewstack.io/podcasts. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.